What's going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Now, in my last video, one of the subscribers reached out and they said, hey Jess, I love these video clips, but what I really want to know is what are the settings in your camera to make these video clips, and how do you edit them in post? So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how I take 24, 60, and 120 frames per second clips, and how I mix them together in Premiere Pro to make videos. Now, when it comes to settings, the one thing that I'm always making sure that I adhere to is the 180 shutter rule. Now, if you don't know what that is, that means that you need to keep your shutter as close to double whatever frame rate you're shooting in. So for instance, right now I'm shooting at 24 frames per second because I'm not gonna slow down this footage. I'm just gonna use it in real time. So I'm shooting at 1/50th of a second. If I wanted to shoot slow motion in either 60 or 120 frames per second, I would change my shutter speed to again be as close to double of whatever frame rate I chose. 60 frames per second, set it to 125th of a second. 120 frames per second, set it to 250th of a second. Now, just like regular photography, I'm always shooting with as low of an ISO as I can, except for when I do use my C-Log 3, the lowest ISO that I'm allowed to use when using auto ISO is ISO 800. So for that reason, mixed with the fact that I have to use the shutter speeds that I need depending on what frame rate I'm using, you're probably going to need ND filters to block some of the light out to create the shots that you want outdoors. Otherwise, you're gonna blow it out with too high of an ISO value and you're not gonna get any type of detail in your sky. You'll probably blow out your face too. The other thing is you're gonna probably wanna shoot it like wide open like I am right now. I'm shooting at f2.8 to create as much separation from my background and my face as I can. So f2.8, 1/50th of a second, ISO 800 equals way too much light. That's why, as a videographer, we all use ND filters when we're outdoors. That way we can block out unwanted light and still be able to create the shallow depths of field that we want to make it look really nice and cinematic. And that's another thing that you want to think about. Like, what type of image do you want to create? Are you creating a shot, like right now, where I'm just going to use it in real time? Or are you gonna create an image that's more B-roll, where you're gonna slow it down and make it like real smooth, real silky? Then you're gonna shoot that at 60 frames per second, where if you're going to be shooting something in real time, like what I'm doing now, I'm shooting this at 24 frames per second. Some places, people standardly shoot at 30 frames per second, where here in the United States, we shoot at 24 frames per second. So depending where you are, you may shoot at 30 or 24, but all of these rules remain the same. Keep your shutter speed as close to double as it can. Keep your ISO values as low as you can. If you want to shoot something like this and have cinematic blur behind you, shoot wide open. So that means with this lens, f2.8. Now, because of all of those rules, or those, if you want to call them rules, you're going to probably have too much light coming in, and that again shows you why you need ND filters when shooting outside. Okay guys, so we got the footage that we need. I've got 24, 60, and 120 frames per second footage out here. So we're gonna go to Premiere Pro. I'm gonna show you how to mix those frame rates together in a 24 frames per second timeline. I'm gonna show you how to make sure to correct your C-Log footage using your Canon R6. And hopefully by the end of all this, you're gonna be able to make your own video. Okay guys, so now what I want to do is bring you into Premiere Pro, and I want to show you that little sequence that you just watched broken down into my editor so that you can understand how to manipulate the footage and make something like that. So the first thing you want to understand is what sequence settings we're working with. So what we want to do to check that out is click the sequence box down here, and then you want to go up to the top, go to sequence, and go to sequence settings. You want to make sure that you set the resolution to 1920 by 1080,
and you want to set the frame rate to 23.976, or essentially 24 frames per second. The reason that we're using the 1080 resolution is because the lowest footage that we take with the Canon R6 when we record at 120 frames per second is 1920 by 1080 resolution, and I would rather downscale my 4K here than upscale my 1080, because that would make my 1080 footage look soft, where I can downscale the 4K and it just looks even nicer. And then at the end of all of this, I'm able to export my project out and bring everything back to 4K. And I have another video that teaches you how to do that, so you can check that out after you go through all of this stuff. We want to go ahead and make sure that, again, we have 1920 by 1080 resolution and 24 frames per second timeline. Go ahead and hit OK. And then what we want to do is drop in whatever type of clips we're using, and I like to select whatever music I'm using first. So I've got this little audio clip here, and the reason that I like to do that is it kind of lets you know like the feel of what type of edit you're about to make, and it's also going to show you where you're going to be cutting your clips, because you're going to make your clips match your music or the beat of your music. Let's go ahead and check out the first scene here. Now the first scene here is shot at 4K resolution at 60 frames per second. So we need to correct two things. We need to correct the resolution and we need to correct the speed that it's being displayed at. Now, I've already done those things, so we're kind of working in reverse here. So what we're gonna do is click that clip and right click on there. And what you can do is see that I've already clicked scale to frame size, but if I hadn't already done that, it would look like it was cropped in. So that's what you would see if you just dropped in a 4K resolution scene into a 1080p timeline. So again, to just correct that, you would just right click and go to scale to frame size. And that's going to scale it down to 1080p. So we've fixed the resolution, so now we want to fix the speed that it's being displayed at. So again, go ahead and right click that clip, go to speed, and then you want to set that to 40%. So when you set a 60 frames per second clip to 40%, you're then going to be displaying it at 24 frames per second. So set it to 40, hit OK, and now you'll notice that that's going to display nice and smooth for you, while also being slightly slowed down. So you don't really want to use audio from this. You can, and there's ways to do that, but you're going to notice that the audio will be slowed down. So you would have to separate it and kind of get it to match up in post in a different type of way. So generally speaking, if you're recording at 60 frames per second, you probably won't use the audio from that. Again, now that we've taken our 4K 60 frames per second scene, corrected it, now everything's good to go. So let's go ahead and find another clip. So again, this one is 60, this one is 60. Okay, here we go. This clip is being displayed at 24 frames per second, and it was also recorded at 24 frames per second. So we didn't have to adjust the speed of it at all. We just drop it in there and it looks perfect. So what we do is just go ahead and drop it in there, and then you can play it. Now, one effect that I did do on this clip is I applied warp stabilizer. It was 24 frames per second, and I was just hand holding the camera, so it was a little jittery. So if you go ahead and click the clip, and you go up here and you hit effects, you're going to see, if I scroll down, that I have applied warp stabilization. And if you don't know how to do that already, all you do is go down and find your effects tab, and then your effects tab is going to have WARP, type it in there, and boom, there it is, warp stabilizer. And you can grab that and drag it and drop it right onto your clip, and then you're going to have warp stabilizer. Now I go in and I adjust the smoothness to 10%, and that's where I start. If that makes it smooth enough, that's where I stay. Usually it does. If it's not smooth enough, then I'll just keep cranking up the aggressiveness until I'm happy with it. Warp stabilizer can kind of make things look weird, so you want to be careful with how aggressive you go with it. Anyway, it ended up working well for this clip, so now what we've got is a 24 frames per second clip. Again, we don't have to adjust the speed at all. This was shot at 4K, so I did have to right click it, and I did have to go to scale to frame size, right? Because if I didn't, it would look like that. But I did. I went right click and I went to scale to frame size, and that makes it displayed at 1080p resolution. So again, now we've seen what we do with a 60 frames per second scene. We've seen what we do with an actual 24 frames per second scene. Now let's see what we do with 120 frames per second scene. Now over here, we've got one. So this is shot at 120 frames per second. Now, the important thing to understand that when the Canon R6 records 120 frames per second, it slows that clip down in the camera. And it ends up exporting out a 30 frames per second file. So when you're dealing with this footage, you already have it at 30 frames per second. So it only needs to be slowed down slightly to match the 24 frames per second timeline that we're working in. So again, you right click. We don't have to correct the resolution because this footage is shot at 1080p resolution, like our timeline, but we do have to correct the speed. So if you go to speed, you'll notice that I have it set to 80%. So 120 frames per second footage, that's already slowed down by the Canon camera and then set to 30 frames per second, only needs to be slowed down to 80% to be correctly displayed at 24 frames per second. So again, 80%, hit OK, and now you're going to notice that this footage is displaying itself smoothly, or as smoothly as it can be, seeing as I'm running as fast as I can. So that's how you go about mixing the 60 or 24 or 120 frames per second footage in a 24 frames per second timeline. That's how you make sure that you, one, match up the resolution, which on our timeline here is 1080p, and we make sure that we match all of the frame rates that we shoot in with 24 frames per second, like the timeline that we've chosen to edit with. Now, the other thing to think about is the fact that we are recording with C-Log 3, because the Canon R6 gets the most dynamic range, and if you're outdoors, that's probably what you're gonna wanna use. So if you noticed in my timeline here, up above the footage, I have an adjustment layer. So if I take that away, you'll notice that this is what the footage looks like. This is uncolor corrected. Now, I've used a LUT that I purchased, and I really like these LUTs because they came with, not only did they come with all of the different types of color profiles that can be shot in, like Cinema Gamut or BT 2020 or Rec 709, but it also gave me different levels of those LUTs so I can correct exposure. If I underexposed or overexposed, I have LUTs that can correct it. And they work really well. Unfortunately, I don't remember what they are or where I purchased them. I know that they work really well, and all I did was Google it. So go ahead and just Google it and you'll find corrective LUTs. I think Canon even puts them out. But there's a bunch of them out there and there's a lot of really good ones. But I start by using just a basic corrective LUT for whatever color space I was recording in. In this case, it was Cinema Gamut C-Log 3. So as you can see, in this adjustment layer, if I reapply it, it color corrects the file. And I have made basic adjustments scene by scene. Maybe it was a little too dark, I might lift the shadows or lift the blacks, or maybe it's a little too bright and I'll pull the highlights back. Maybe I'll add a little bit of saturation, or sometimes I even need to pull it away. That all goes by your eye, but the LUT gives you a basic understanding of where you want to start at. So again, if I go into my adjustment layer and I go over to my Lumetri color here, what I do is I go into the Creative tab, and this is where I apply my LUTs. So you click here, you go to Browse, and this is going to allow you to navigate to wherever you have your LUTs saved, and then you can apply one of those corrective LUTs into your footage, and it's going to take care of everything for you for the most part. So see, now I just took it away. So now I'm just going to hit Command Z, bring it back. So again, I now have a C-Log Cinema Gamut corrective LUT applied, and then I just make basic tweaks from there. But you can see that the C-Log footage does come out pretty flat, and it definitely will need to be corrected. But it's pretty easy once you have one of those corrective LUTs. So those are the basic things that you want to focus on when you think about trying to make a little sequence like this. Like, what type of shot are you going to be using, right? Is it going to be 60 frames per second? Are you going to slow it down? Is it going to be 24 frames per second and displayed in real time? And then again, you're going to want to select some type of music, and you're going to want to try to set those scenes up to the beat of that song. And the beat of that song is going to kind of decide what the feel of that segment is. So that's again why I say I like to decide what music I'm going to use first, and then I start grabbing the clips and kind of filling in the gaps and making the story with everything that I can. Anyway, guys, I hope that this helped you out a little bit. If it did, go below, subscribe, click the notification bell, and I'll see you on my next video.